Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to the Center for Global Development. My name is Mark Plant. I'm a senior policy fellow at CGD, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Our president, Masoud Ahmed, sends his regrets for being unable to be with us today. We're pleased to be the host today for a seminar on a recent report by the Independent Evaluation Office, the IEO, of the IMF, on the impact of growth on IMF-supported programs in its member countries. Joining us today for this seminar are two members of the IEO, its director, Charles Collins, and Jun Kim, an advisor in the IEO. I would note that the IEO is independent of the management and staff of the IMF, reporting directly to the executive board of the institution. We're also pleased to welcome our panel, three distinguished economists. We have with us Ken Kang, who's Deputy Director of the Strategy, Policy and Review Department at the IMF, Dauda Sembene, a distinguished non-resident fellow at CGD and formerly a member of the IMF's executive board and a high-ranking official of the government of Senegal, and Rachel Turner, the Director of International Finance of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, in the United Kingdom. The link between growth and IMF-supported programs is a long-standing discussion. Critics of the IMF have often decried the fund as imposing overly stringent conditions on countries that borrow from the fund, placing short-term objectives of macroeconomic stability above longer-term considerations of setting the economy on a future growth path. They blame the social disruption and economic constraints that occur at the same time as IMF borrowing on the fund's policy prescriptions. Yet we know that counterfactuals can't be observed. What would the economy have looked like without the fund's financial and policy assistance? After all, countries with economies in good health do not seek the IMF assistance. And without the assistance, the deterioration in economies might have even been worse. To use the overused doctor analogy, it is a medicine helping the patient or killing the patient. This study looks carefully at these issues anew, and I won't steal the IEO's thunder by summarizing its conclusions. They're quite stark and compelling. Instead, I want to underscore how important it is to have this discussion at this moment. We're in a time when many countries have been suffering economic hardship due to the pandemic, and they're looking for paths to reestablish growth and for low-income countries to begin anew the task of poverty reduction. There's also the imperative of making a transformation to a greener and more equitable economy in every country and globally. So countries will look to the IMF and other partners for advice, financial support in that quest. In fact, the IMF is considering establishing a new facility to support countries in achieving a resilient and sustainable recovery. But there are big questions as to how such financial support should be designed. What should the IMF ask of countries, and how should its financial support be linked to those demands? Studies like the one before us today will be critical for the IMF and for others to frame their thinking about how we emerge country by country from the biggest global economic contraction in over a century. The IEO study gives us the first steps in what will be a very long journey. So let's hear what the IEO is suggesting and what our panelists think about the best path forward. After the panelists' intervention, we will take questions from the audience. You can send us your questions three different ways. On Twitter, you can tweet to @CGDev or #CGDTalks. By email, you can email us at events@cgdev.org, or there's a question button on your YouTube channel where you can have questions. They'll all be referred to me as the moderator. So with that introduction, let me turn the floor over to Jun and Charles. I think, Jun, you're going to start the presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. Let me begin by thanking the Center for Global Development for inviting us to present the findings and recommendations of the IEO's latest evaluation on growth and adjustment in IMF-supported programs. Hunter, I can't see the slides. Can you move to slide 2? Thank you. The main objective of this evaluation is to assess how well IMF-supported programs have helped to support economic growth while delivering necessary adjustment for external viability, and then draw lessons on the fund's lending and conditionality framework and make recommendations. The evaluation was motivated by the IMF's mandate as specified in the Articles of Agreement, which calls for helping members to correct BOP problems without resorting to measures destructive of national or international prosperity, as well as criticism on funds austerity bias and insufficient attention to growth in staff guidance on program conditionality. Next slide, please. The evaluation covers IMF financing arrangements with conditionality approved and completed between September 2008 and March 2020, but not those arranged after the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Main findings and lessons are based on 6 thematic studies and 17 country case studies across 5 regions, all of which are posted in the IEO's website. Next slide, please. I will present key findings of the evaluation, as well as some general lessons from country case studies, and then Charles will discuss the evaluation's recommendations and reactions of the IMF board and management to the evaluation. My presentation will cover key findings on growth and adjustment aspects of IMF programs, including empirical evidence on growth outcomes, growth optimism, and the range of growth supporting measures in the program context, such as fiscal policy, structural reforms, exchange rate policy, and market debt operations. Next slide, please. Let me first discuss the findings on the growth aspects of the program. The IMF's increasing attention to supporting activity during a program and fostering medium-term growth seems to have delivered some positive results. Program growth outcomes, which are represented by the blue line in the chart, showed U-shaped trajectory in GRA programs with the trough in the first year of the program, which is particularly pronounced in crisis GRA programs arranged in response to the global financial crisis and Euro area debt crisis. In contrast, growth outcomes were much steadier in other GRA programs and in PRGT programs as well, with significantly less cross-country variation than in crisis GRA programs, as indicated by the interquartile range in shade in the chart. A more formal empirical evidence supports that the growth effects of the program are more positive than this simple picture might suggest, as we will see in the next 2 slides. Next slide, please. The upshot is that we did not find evidence of a consistent bias toward excessive austerity in fund programs during the evaluation period. Cross-country evidence shown in the upper chart suggests that relative to a counterfactor of no fund engagement, both GRA and PRGT programs, when completed, have yielded growth benefits during the program in the order of 0.7 to 1.1 percentage points. Evidence also suggests larger benefits for completed programs with a stronger implementation and higher depths of structural conditions than otherwise, aided in part by the confidence effect. As indicated by the blue bars in the bottom chart, the difference in growth gains between low and high depths of structural conditions is quite pronounced in GRA programs, which is in the order of 0.9 to 1.2 percentage points. Next slide, please. The evaluation also looked at program growth outcomes relative to a benchmark which could be considered as the country-specific historical norm, and actually is estimated by using country-specific factors, trends and external factors only, such as the terms of trade, trading partners' growth, and the US policy interest rate. Except in the crisis context, program growth outcomes were broadly in line with historical norms. Specifically, growth deviations from the estimated historical norms are negative and often large enough to be statistically significant in crisis programs, as indicated by dark blue bars in the chart, but less so or even positive in other GRA programs as well as in PRGT programs. Overall, gross deviations were negative and statistically significant in less than 12% of the sample. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. No, can you go back? After these findings on the short-term growth impact of IMF programs, the remaining question would be what are the medium to long-term growth implications of IMF programs? For the medium-term growth impact, the evaluation found that stabilizations and reforms implemented during the program have affected post-program growth positively. For the longer-run growth impact, we looked at historical data over the period from 1980 to 2020 and identified 132 growth surges of 8 years or longer in 117 countries, 56% of which were associated with IMF programs. Further analysis suggests that IMF programs have indeed played a positive role at initiating sustained growth surges, particularly through restoring macroeconomic stability and enhancing structural reforms. Interestingly, the IMF's positive role was stronger in the 2000s and in emerging market economies than in the previous 2 decades and elsewhere. Next slide, please. Notwithstanding these positive findings, program growth outcomes consistently fell short of program projections, more so in GRA than in PRGT programs. About 1/2 of the programs experienced a growth shortfall of 0.5 percentage point or more, while 1/4 had a growth shortfall of over 1.5 percentage points. What are the sources of such growth optimism? Cross-country evidence suggests that less realistic assumptions on fiscal multipliers, which were not discussed widely in program documents, have been a source, especially in GRA programs outside of a crisis context. Case studies also show that political economy factors in program negotiations, such as pressures on funded staff and authorities to agree on excessively sanguine projections, hoping to sustain domestic support, motivated ambitious growth projection, while program design paid limited attention to contingencies to respond to growth shortfalls. Next slide, please. Now, let me turn to the adjustment aspects of the program, focusing on growth supporting policies and reforms. Fiscal policies typically incorporated growth-friendly measures, but with mixed success. For instance, tax mobilization improved in PRGT programs, providing some fiscal space for productive public investment. In GRA programs, the post-program tax structure became more growth-friendly, although fiscal adjustment relied heavily on spending cuts during the program. However, health and education spending did not increase significantly in either PRGT or GRA programs. And the protection of low-income and vulnerable groups fell short of program goals. Moreover, gross benefits of higher public investment were limited by poor project selection and wasteful implementation, especially in PRGT programs. So to help address these concerns, more attention needs to be paid to improving public financial management and governance, as well as monitoring and reporting on the social and distributional impact. Next slide, please. Turning to structural reforms, evidence suggests that structural conditionality generally helped to promote growth during and after programs, with a stronger growth impact for structural conditions with higher depth and growth orientation. However, the potential growth benefits were not fully realized because the bulk of conditions was oriented to stabilization, as shown in the chart, and of relatively low depth and growth orientation. In addition, the capacity development assistance has not been consistently effective in strengthening the implementation of structural conditions. The evaluation found that implementation was significantly weaker in areas outside fund expertise and where collaboration was sought. These findings suggest structural conditionality should focus on deeper and more growth-supporting reforms, supported by closer integration of program and capacity development work and stronger collaboration with relevant partners, particularly the World Bank. Next slide, please. It is well known that in the face of an external shock, exchange rate depreciation can help support growth while facilitating external adjustment. However, the use of the exchange rate as a policy tool was quite limited in programs. For example, exchange rate regime transition was infrequent and more often toward greater fixity rather than flexibility, and PRGT programs relying on the exchange rate anchor tended to lose competitiveness. Nevertheless, it is notable that program efforts were typically made to correct significant pre-program overvaluation. Indeed, the cross-country analysis found that the significant real effective depreciation, where occurred, supported external adjustment and growth, particularly in PRGT programs. So these findings suggest that there would be greater scope to use the exchange rate as a policy tool, while at the same time respecting the country's regime choice and avoiding exchange rate manipulation, particularly if a supportive policy framework such as a deep FX market and the credible inflation anchor is already in place. Next slide, please. Before discussing the findings on debt operations, I'd like to highlight that the evaluation focused on the experience of market debt operations as opposed to official debt operations, which have been discussed extensively elsewhere. In a number of cases, market debt operations were useful in restoring debt sustainability. In the program context, debt operations with principal haircuts and upfront fiscal adjustment were more successful than debt reprofiling or coupon reduction in renewing market access and restoring growth. However, debt operations were sometimes too little and too late for various reasons, including technical difficulties in reaching agreement with the creditors and some political concerns. This experience suggests that while respecting the neutrality principle, the IMF should seek to ensure ambitious debt operations upfront based on careful application of the debt sustainability analysis frameworks. Next slide, please. While the findings discussed thus far are obtained largely from cross-country analysis, country case studies offered many valuable lessons based on diverse country experience. Let me close my presentation by summarizing 3 general lessons from country case studies. First, there is no simple recipe for delivering better growth outcomes in IMF programs, given the variety of country circumstances and preferences. For any recipe to be successful, however, the adjustment and growth strategy should be fully owned by the government and broadly supported. Second, the groundwork for a successful policy response should ideally be laid well in advance through surveillance and capacity development work, because meaningful reforms take several years to put in place and become effective, even with capacity development support by the fund. Third, growth and reform strategies should pay adequate attention to social and distributional consequences. Fair distribution of the burden of adjustment and the rewards of recovery are of prime importance to meet national goals and to ensure continued public support for program implementation. I'll start here and then Charles will take over. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. And I think you did an excellent job in summarizing a lot of very complicated material. And I do recommend people, if they're interested, to look at our website to be able to to look in detail at our background papers. If we move to the next slide, I will talk about the 3 recommendations that we made in our report to the board coming out of the evaluation's findings. First, and probably most important, the fund should pay greater attention to the growth implications of IMF-supported programs. This attention should be more thorough, it should be more systematic, it should be more realistic, and it should be more sensitive to the social and distributional consequences. Essentially, this needs to occur both in the program design stage and discussions with country authorities, and in the program documents presented to the board. They should clearly analyze what are the country's, the program's growth implications, how do they help the country to meet its growth objectives, what is the strategy, and what are the analytical underpinnings for that strategy. Greater attention needs to be paid to the distributional consequences, the quality aspects of growth, not just the aggregate impact on GDP. Greater attention needs to be paid to making sure that fiscal multipliers are realistic and appropriate. And greater attention needs to be paid to developing contingencies in case there are shortfalls in growth emerging, so that there can be a quick response where issues arise. We suggest that all of these factors should be considered in the context of the conditionality guidelines and the operational guidance note on conditionality, which provides guidance to staff on how to go about designing programs and implementing programs. In fact, the conditionality guidelines haven't been revised since 2002. So I think an overhaul of those guidelines is well overdue, in particular to pay attention to these growth-related aspects. If we look to the next slide, we give particular attention to the need to pay greater attention on supporting deeper, more growth-oriented structural reforms. As June said, typically reforms in programs are focused more on the adjustment side than on the growth side, and often they're rather shallow. They should be geared more to what is important and not what is most easy to agree on or to monitor, or where the fund has core expertise. There's a general principle that we respect, that conditionality should be parsimonious, not excessively burdensome, but at the same time, it needs to be focused on what are the real issues to correcting underlying distortions, removing structural impediments to allow stronger growth. How can this be achieved in a fund which has limited expertise in a number of areas that are essential to generating stronger growth? I think a key message is that collaboration with the World Bank needs to be strengthened to ensure that adequate attention is paid in the program context to growth-related issues. And also that the fund should think further about how to support reforms with its capacity development support, which needs to be more deeply integrated into program design and implementation in order to support deeper and more successful reform efforts. To move to the next slide, third recommendation, the fund should continue to invest in building its toolkit of models and monitors for analysis and assessment of adjustment and growth issues. The fund does do a lot of work in this area, but I think the focus should be more on developing models that are tractable and accessible by country desks and suitable for analyzing the adjustment growth relationship in the program context. This will help country teams to produce more realistic projections and better explain how the projections derive from the policies of the program and what are the associated risks. Similarly, more attention needs to be paid on the distributional aspects by developing and deploying monitors to help assess the impact of the program on key distributional indicators. And this work, again, should be in close collaboration with the World Bank and other agencies. And then my final slide is on the reactions and follow-up. It's very important for us that our reports are not just solid analysis, but actually catalyze change in the institution to achieve stronger results. We present our reports to the board at that board discussion at the end of August. Both the managing director and the executive board welcomed the evaluation and broadly supported its findings and all of its recommendations. The report was viewed as being particularly timely and very relevant, as many members are now facing very difficult circumstances as they seek to recover from the pandemic and turning to the fund for financial support. At the same time, I should mention that there are a number of qualifications mentioned both by the managing director and by the board, which I think reflect underlying tensions. The fund's core objective in providing financing is to help a country resolve its balance of payments need. A number of directors emphasized that attention to growth should not compromise the ability of a program to restore external viability. So getting the balance right to achieve both external viability and growth at the same time is certainly challenging. And similarly, a number of directors raised concerns about how the fund would be able to include in programs areas outside its core areas of expertise. And this is, again, I think a longstanding challenge in the fund, how to bring in partners so that appropriate attention can be paid to aspects of policies that are really essential for achieving growth. Next steps, there will be a management implementation plan developed by staff with management and presented to the executive board within 6 months by February 2022. Looking forward to that and to working with staff to developing that plan. I'll stop there. Thanks very much. Maybe you can just turn to our final slide, showing pictures of all the people who contributed to our report. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, June. That's a very interesting report. It has many echoes of things I've heard before, but I think there's some new elements too for the fund to react to. So I'll be interested to hear the reactions of the fund through Ken and the other panelists. Let me remind our audience that if you want to send questions in, you can do so by Twitter, by tweeting @CGDev or hashtag CGD Talks, email events@cgdev.org, or you can use the question button on your YouTube channel. So Ken, what's the reaction to the fund staff and management to this report? As I hear it, I hear lots of echoes of similar themes to the transition from the Enhanced Structural Adjustment Facility to the PRGT. Are we looking at sort of a broader revolution at the fund toward growth, or how's the fund going to grapple with these thorny issues that they put forward? Ken.
No, thanks very much, Mark. Revolution is not the term people typically use to describe the fund. I will call it more evolution here. But first of all, let me just say that it's my pleasure to be here in this panel and among friends. And let me thank the CGD for hosting this very timely event, and also to our Charles and Junio for their excellent report, case studies, and presentation on growth and adjustment in IMF-supported programs. As you pointed out, the timing of this IEO review could not have been better, as fund lending is currently at an all-time high. Though the IEO evaluation does not cover the current pandemic programs, it has the scope, nevertheless, to shape our collective thinking on how to further improve fund programs going forward to the benefit of our members. We at the fund have worked closely with the IEO during their evaluation, which culminated in the board meeting in late August. And as the managing director expressed in her statement on the report, we agree with the overall IEO assessment, which is broadly consistent with our own 2018 review of program design and conditionality. We also broadly agree with the IEO recommendations and are currently working on the Management Implementation Plan, so-called MIP, to address the IEO's recommendations. Let me offer some thoughts on the points raised by Junil in his presentation on their findings and its implications for the IMF's work. First, we are pleased with the IEO's findings that there is no evidence of any consistent bias towards excessive austerity in fund-supported programs. As you know well, the fund has been subject to criticism of focusing too much on fiscal austerity in economic adjustment programs. This IEO assessment helps dispel those doubts. We also welcome the IEO's assessment that fund-supported programs did yield growth benefits vis-a-vis the counterfactual of having no program in place. In other words, countries in need of fund financial support often would have been worse off otherwise, and that stabilization and reforms undertaken under the programs help boost growth afterwards. This is important to keep in mind as we may need time to see the benefits of the adjustment efforts and program measures. We also welcome the IEO's findings that the fiscal multiplier assumptions were broadly in line with the guidance given to staff and the empirical literature. This is another important area given the research that has been done showing how macro financial conditions matter a lot in affecting the size of fiscal multipliers, as well as the composition of the adjustment path. This also highlights the challenges in assessing fiscal multipliers ex ante, especially in a crisis context, and also speaks to the importance of applying flexibly these tools. Let me turn to the recommendations, which we also broadly support, and in particular need for more thoroughly discussing growth issues in fund-supported programs. Growth considerations, including policies to achieve sustained medium-term growth, have been at the center of IMF program design and conditionality. And while it's important to support economic adjustment and reforms for sustained growth over the medium term, growth cannot be placed above or equal to the core objective of fund lending to help members resolve their balance of payments problems, according to our Articles of Agreement. Hence, the focus should be on providing further guidance on fund-supported programs in fostering sustainable growth, taking into account the quality of growth while avoiding growth optimism in our program projections. We also agree with the other IEO recommendations on growth-enhancing structural reforms and the toolkit of models. On structural reforms, I would highlight, as others have done, the importance of the fund's collaboration with the World Bank and other partners. We typically collaborate closely with World Bank on a range of topics, including structural fiscal issues and social support to financial development. As noted, we can do better here, not only in the program context, but also in surveillance and capacity development activities. And here we are working on another management implementation plan based on the 2020 IEO report on IMF collaboration with the World Bank on macro structural issues such as climate, which should be issued fairly soon. More recently, the fund has also collaborated closely with the World Bank on fragile and conflict affected states and SDR channeling, which I will touch on a bit later. While fund-supported programs should remain open to promote structural agenda outside the fund's core mandate and expertise, if needed for program success, we should not lose sight of the importance of being parsimonious and prioritizing conditionality, as also highlighted by our 2018 review of conditionality and earlier IEO work. We should also revisit how our capacity development support is integrated with program design and implementation, with the aim to promote deeper and more successful reforms in a program. The benefits of more effective CD would also depend on the country's implementation capacity. And in this context, the ongoing IEO evaluation of IMF CD is also very timely. And we will also undertake a strategic view of our CD work in 2023. The multilateral and bilateral donors also play an important role in these efforts. MDBs and bilateral donors can provide a range of support, complementing the mandate and expertise of the fund to support growth-oriented reforms through technical assistance and capacity building. In addition, MDB support through grants and concessional loans will be critical in the coming period, as many low-income countries are struggling with high levels of debt. And finally, on the role of the fund in helping developing countries address the pandemic recovery, which you mentioned, Mark, our approach has been multifaceted. We have provided financial assistance to some 87 countries and debt relief to the poorest 29 countries since the onset of the COVID pandemic. Going forward, our high quality program, so-called upper credit tranche quality, are expected to play a bigger role in supporting the pandemic recovery. IMF financing, especially under these UCT quality programs, have shown the importance of the fund's catalytic role in mobilizing other sources of financing, which will also be important going forward. We're also supporting ongoing debt restructuring initiatives, for example, the DSSI and the Common Framework, where stronger action on debt is part of a comprehensive package in support of low-income countries. The historic $650 billion SDR allocation will particularly help our most vulnerable countries struggling to cope with the impact of the pandemic. We have some members with strong external positions who have expressed their interest to voluntarily channel some of these SDRs to support the poor and vulnerable countries. These channeling options include scaling up resources for our Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, which provides concessional support interest-free, and establishing a new Resilience and Sustainability Trust to help our members with key challenges related to climate change, pandemic preparedness, and digitalization. At the same time, it is important that developing countries also pursue an ambitious structural reform agenda to raise their long-term growth potential. IMF research in the 2019 World Economic Outlook report showed that the pace of structural reforms in emerging and developing economies has slowed since the early 2000s. According to this research, comprehensive reforms could double the speed of convergence of the average emerging market and low-income country to the living standards of advanced economies, raising annual GDP growth by about 1 percentage point for some time. The work also shows that the reform gains tend to be larger when governance and access to credit are strong. And here I would strongly endorse the IEO's recommendation to continue to invest in building up the toolkit for analyzing and monitoring the link between structural reforms and growth and its distributional consequences. The IMF has developed new models for examining debt sustainability and resource constraints, and our research department has created a valuable structural reform database to help inform policy design and capacity building. We need to continue important work in these areas. To conclude, as mentioned, we broadly agree with the overall assessment and recommendations. They will serve as useful inputs for our management implementation plan and ongoing reviews of our program conditionality. They are an important part of our learning process as an institution serving our member countries. So let me again thank Charles and his team and the CBG for the opportunity to discuss this useful report. I look forward to Dawoda's and Rachel's marks as well. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you for that strong endorsement, if you will, of the report's findings. It'll be very interesting to watch how the fund indeed incorporates that into its work plan. Dawoda, you have been on the fund staff. You have served as a high-level country official making difficult decisions in your country about growth and adjustment, and you've served on the fund board, so you've in some sense been in all places. How do you view the contribution of this report, and how should it change the needle in the way the fund and countries interact?
Well, thank you very much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be with you today, along with the distinguished panelists. I think I first need to congratulate IEO for another very insightful report, and I think on a very interesting and important topics, which is actually a growth and adjustment in IMF-supported program. You asked me what needs to be done differently in helping the authorities shape a growth-oriented reform program. I think the IEO has really been on point on identifying what needs to be done differently. I think the 3 recommendations that Charles and June just talked about and that are actually extracted from the report are very much on point and certainly highlight the need to pay more attention to the growth implication of programs and also the social and distributional consequences. Also the need to improve IMF support for growth-oriented reforms and also improve the analysis of adjustment growth relationship. I won't get back to that. What I will do is actually welcome the fact that both the IMF Executive Board and the IMF Management endorse these recommendations, because I think this would, by implementing them, they will certainly make headways in improving the way adjustment is made in the context of IMF-supported program. What I will do is to focus, based on IEO recommendation and findings, I will focus on a few issues that I think are critical for ensuring effective implementation of the recommendations, but also actually optimizing the growth impact of adjustment. And I will speak about two big issues, which the first one being the step that needs to be taken to determine the appropriate composition and pace of adjustment in the context of IMF-supported program, because these are actually critically important for growth. And also in the second part, I would also talk about the needs to better understand, monitor, and of course address the issues that shapes the social and distributional consequences of adjustment. On the first issue, I think let's start with the composition of adjustment. I think the first thing that the IMF needs to do, of course, is to determine a more appropriate composition of adjustment. As we know, this has critical implication for growth, and to do that, the institution needs to better assess the potential implication of adjustment for growth. And I think this is an important point that IEO made in its report, which is important because it helps mitigate the risk for underestimating the adverse growth impact of adjustment, or actually on the other side, in unduly sort of raising expectations about the positive effect of growth. So this is critical. I would take one example from the report. It's the case of fiscal adjustment. What the report tells us is that there is a risk that when staff do not handle well the multipliers, the fiscal multipliers, there is a risk that they misestimate or they misappreciate the level of fiscal multipliers in some specific circumstances where those multipliers are increased, their size is increased. And I think IEO gave the example of weak economies, but also the example of countries where there is limited scope for implementing a monetary policy. My sense is, unfortunately, for low-income countries, this risk is materializing. What I mean here is I'm taking evidence from the IEO report, which actually confirms that for PRGT program that are implemented in low-income countries, the overall fiscal multiplier is usually significantly larger than estimated in the literature and in the multipliers used in program design. And I think actually this is something that is critical and that needs really to be addressed by the IMF. And my guess is to do that, it is critical for the institution to improve how its internal guidance on the estimation and use of fiscal multipliers actually is being applied. And I think this is one recommendation that the IEO made. One other issue that is critical to address, and I think I'm just going to say it on the side before continuing, is the growth optimism bias. I think this is really important and critical for the IMF to solve this issue once for all. This has been actually a perennial issue that have been facing the institution. But it is, of course, more concerning that, of course, that the bias is larger in GRA program than PRGT programs. Why? Because by design, everyone knows that actually the more ambitious growth projections are in a program, the less strict are the required fiscal adjustment. So I think by doing that, what is happening is the institution may not be treating, countries that are using concessional financing and other countries that are using non-concessional financing in the same way. So this needs to be addressed. One other issue is, of course, the pace of adjustment. I think it is critical to take necessary steps to calibrate the pace and in a way that optimizes the effect of the pace on growth. And I think what the IMF has been doing recently has been commendable. I think it has been trying in the context of the pandemic to ensure flexibility in setting the pace and tailoring to country-specific circumstances. And I think this is very much welcome. And I certainly agree with IEO that the countries with limited capacity, in those countries, usually there could be actually scope for adopting more gradual adjustment paths. And I think this is something that has to be kept in mind for calibrating the right appropriate pace of adjustment. I certainly understand that when there is a BOP crisis, this is difficult there is a limited scope to adjusting the pace of adjustment, but I think the evidence also sort of points the needs to really make inroad in that effort, because if I understand well what the IEO report is saying on that is, even if you take GRA cases, countries where there was a POP crisis, the evaluation confirms that actually deep fiscal adjustment was associated with deeper output contraction than projected. And I think there was a case of Latvia, Mongolia, and Romania. So this is actually something that the IMF needs to really look at to better calibrate the pace of adjustment. One last issue that I wanted to talk about. I think everyone agrees, as the IEO has pointed out, that the fund needs to better monitor and address the social and distributional consequences of adjustment. I think everyone would agree that. And I think this is actually very much fortunate that the IEO actually added in its 3 recommendations. Because this is critical for the sustainability of adjustment. It's also critical for the potential for adjustment to foster inclusive growth. My concern is this is not new. I think when I read this, it reminds me of the famous poverty and social impact assessments that the fund used to have in the past. I think there has been always an understanding that we need to take better account, talking about the institution, not part of it anymore. The institution needs to take better account of these issues. And of course, anytime the evaluation comes, the institution recognizes that and say that it's going to do it. But unfortunately, it's always falls short of meeting the objective. And I think this is very much critical that this time, actually, as part of the management implementation plan that is being prepared for this specific recommendation, that the IMF does find the right solutions to this. And of course, the IEO is correct that one of the solutions is to deepen the collaboration with the World Bank, but also other international institutions and also bilateral partners. But I would also focus on another solution, or actually suggestion that I would want to make to really help address better the social and distributional consequences of adjustment. It is that, it is critical for the IMF to deal more effectively with the political economy of reform. This is important. I think if you read the report, it tells you that if you take, for instance, growth optimism bias, the growth optimism bias has some explanation in the political economy. Some political economic factors, including the pressures to sustain domestic support for the underlying reform program, sometimes explain this bias. So there is also actually political economic factors that determine, of course, the feasibility and composition of adjustment. So long as the IMF is not necessarily actually prepared to address those political economic issues and consideration, my sense is it's going to risk falling short of making sure that actually it addresses the social and distributional consequences of adjustment. This needs to be addressed. How would you address? I think this is up to management and the IMF and the board to do it. Are they going to actually go for an in-house unit for that, or actually rely on other institutional expertise like the World Bank and others? I think it's the management choice, but it has to be done. Otherwise, I think the reality is adjustment is very much often driven by these political economic consideration, more so than efficiency motive in many countries. So long as the IMF is not necessarily actually equipped to understand those issues, it may always actually have difficulties in helping optimize the growth payoff of a reform package. Maybe at this time, that's where I want to stop and look forward to coming back and adding some insight. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Dada. Question, I think it's an appropriate one that we've heard some of these stories before. Rachel, let me turn to you. The FCDO, the UK government, has been broadly supportive of the IMF. You're a supporter of the PRGT. You very much led the international community on development and growth issues over the last decade. How do you see this report? What's new and what's old? What can be done? Rachel.
Thanks very much, Mark. It's a good report. I enjoyed reading. I think we all enjoyed reading it on the economic side in FCDO. I mean, a lot of it is not new, though. I mean, I think what feels new, it's there all in one place. And in a way, it feels to me like it's almost, it's almost like an absolute essential toolkit for the IMF team to have in front of them. It's the manual, yeah? I mean, I agree with others who've asked, what is it that is constraining teams from responding to the recommendations in this report? Many of the issues repeat earlier guidance. Daud was talking about measuring the social impact. So I think there's, I think we absolutely have to get to the bottom of why is this stuff so hard and what are the constraints? We need to understand the institutional response, I think, at a slightly deeper level. Because a lot of it feels familiar, but I love the way it's all in one place. I think it feels robust. The country studies feel really useful. I think for me, there were 5 things that I wanted to pick out. I think the first thing is almost sort of buried in the report is this quite important recommendation about options and trade-off, and the fact that programs don't present options. I mean, good economics requires option appraisal. Yeah, it's what we're all brought up to do. And yet one only ever sees one central case in a program design. So I thought the recommendation around options and exposing the growth, austerity, adjustment trade-offs was a really important one. I don't know what that would feel like in practice, but it felt to me that was something worth surfacing. I agree with Daud on the multipliers point. We did see in one of the really good papers from the fund last year on the impact of the pandemic and the response to the pandemic, some really interesting work looking at the marginal propensity to consume, with a strong recommendation from the IMF that social safety nets have the strongest MPC of fiscal support. And I think that sense of understanding the multiplier effects from your social spend is really important. And social spend often gets kind of put in a sort of slightly do-goody bucket, but I think understanding the interplay between the social spend and growth, particularly on the sort of aggregate supply side and the aggregate demand side, I think is really important. So I think the multiplier piece and the recommendation on understanding differential multiplier impacts by income group in order to understand how different income groups affect the growth story is really important. It isn't just monitoring what happens to different groups, it's understanding how they themselves are inside the growth story and therefore endogenous to the overall adjustment growth trade-off. And I think that was a good recommendation. It's difficult, but I think that was really important and needs taking forward. I mean, the shock stuff, this is, I think, many people know in FCDO, we are very focused on the phrase we like to use is shocks are not surprises. And I think the fact that growth paths are often thrown off by shocks comes through strongly in the report. This is not new. Yeah, we've been talking about this for years and years. We know that shocks have asymmetric effects. We know that there are better ways to deal with shocks, with contingency, with prearranged financing. So I think I'd have liked to see the shock recommendation taken a bit further forward into prearranged precautionary layers in IMF programs. And that's a very live issue at the moment in the design of the RST, given the RST's focus on climate, whether it comes with a precautionary shock layer. So I thought that was really important. I think on the growth, so on the growth and the conditionality point, I mean, I think our experience in FCDO has been that, if you're going to take growth conditionality, you have to have a growth strategy. Yeah, it's not enough to just randomly choose a few interesting things that might be important for growth. So this sort of slightly ad hoc choice of a couple of structural growth benchmarks needs to be derived from a growth strategy. So I think, one of the things that would be interesting to, hear perhaps more from IEO on is whether they felt the kind of underlying growth strategy in the country was there. And that's a very live issue at the moment. I think growth strategies have gone in and out of fashion a little bit. And I think we've found our partners increasingly have industrial strategies, in a way that they maybe didn't have a few years ago, with a much stronger focus on the manufacturing sector, the high-tech service sector. And so the bones of growth strategies do seem more sophisticated than they've been in the past. And it is easier, I think, to, if you like, take more effective conditionality. I think in that same vein, I think the recommendations about infrastructure were very interesting. Again, this is not new, and I think the issue is really there's something a little bit in the tone of the report that almost equates infrastructure with growth, and I think it's really important, going back to my points around the aggregate supply and the aggregate demand. It's almost economics 101, isn't it? But infrastructure is part and parcel of growth, but your growth story isn't all about your capital account. It's also about your recurrent account. But I think on the infrastructure piece, I think by now we really need to be getting to the bottom of what is it that means that it's difficult for countries to be prioritizing infrastructure. And there is a conundrum at the heart of the infrastructure prioritization, because infrastructure is coming bundled with financing, and finance ministries face hard choices. Do they choose the project with the softer financing that might be lower value for money and less important for growth but less debt creating, or do they choose the more expensive project that's more debt creating but better for growth? And those are really hard trade-offs, and that's something about how the entire infrastructure sector works at the moment, both from the OECD, how they finance infrastructure, and beyond the OECD. So I think that was a really important recommendation. It felt a little bit light to me. I felt it could have gone a bit deeper. So yeah, I think those were the main things I wanted to say, Mark. I mean, I really think it's a good report. I think to have it all in one place, it is really valuable. These are all issues that those of us who, work closely with the fund have been working on for a long time. But I think seeing it all in this sort of coherent way, the way IEO have packaged it together, is really important. And I think on our side, we'll certainly be making it kind of 101 reading for the economists in FCDO, just a really important contribution to our policy work. Thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. I think you're right. It's an important report, and I hadn't realized it does bring all these themes together, and many of them aren't new themes. So maybe Charles and June, I'll come back to you. How do you see the newness of the report? I mean, other than bringing everything together, what in the report is going to make the change happen at the fund, or what does the fund really need to do to make the change happen? Because again, we've heard lots of these things before. Charles, to you first, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking as the panelists spoke on exactly those issues. I think one of the key points that we emphasize more than has been the case within the fund is that dealing with this well-established pattern of growth optimism is not just about being more realistic in doing your projections, marking down the projections to more achievable levels, but rather thinking hard about how you raise the likely growth impact of the program, using the various tools and policies that we analyze in the report. And in order to do that, you need to have a systematic strategy that is discussed between the authorities and the fund. The strategy has to be owned by the country, but it needs to be vetted in a sense by the fund, and the fund needs to help the country to advance that strategy. And I agree with Rachel that too often the sort of growth elements of a program are ad hoc, and we find that they're typically rather shallow and do very little for growth. And that's sort of our main push, is to try to get the fund out of this approach of being very parsimonious to the extent that it only deals with things that are easy to deal with given the fund's existing expertise, rather than tackling the deeper underlying issues that take the fund out of its comfort zone, may require stronger partnerships with others, particularly the World Bank. And those partnerships are not easy. But then I think for the fund to be more effective in helping countries to achieve better growth outcomes, and particularly better social and distributional outcomes, those partnerships are essential. And then final point I would make on this infrastructure issue, I think one of the things that we say in the report is that capital spending by itself is not necessarily very positive for growth. The multipliers that we found for capital spending, at least in the short term, were low. And many of the case studies identified serious issues of misallocation of capital spending that really undermine the longer term growth impact. So we emphasized the importance of combining more resources for capital spending with serious efforts to improve the governance around it, surrounding the capital spending, to make sure that the capital spending is well allocated and really generates positive growth benefits. I'll stop there. Thanks.
June, do you want to add anything in?
Thanks, Mark. I think Charles has already mentioned very important points, but I'd like to add one more thing, as Ken also highlighted, the importance of developing models, because this issue is related to calibrating correctly the fiscal multipliers and the trade-offs between growth and adjustment, and also the gross impacts of structural reforms. As mentioned by Ken, the IMF has already been quite active in developing various types of models, ranging from a very simple one to very sophisticated, dynamic models that can cover the many countries and take into account spillover effects. But still, we need to develop some more simple, tractable models for country teams that can be used to calibrate the adjustment and growth relationship and particularly in low-income countries where the data are quite limited. And also, I believe the research department and the database on structural reform index, I know well about this because I was in that department for several years. And then I found that this database is quite useful. And actually, we use this database to substantiate our findings on the role of the structural reforms in a program context. And lastly, for expertise, I believe the fund needs to develop a little bit more expertise on areas outside the core mandate, for example, like structural reforms. Perhaps the previous evaluation on the bank fund collaboration highlight the importance of collaboration with the World Bank in structural and macrostructure issues. But I think still maybe fund staff need a little bit more expertise to enable themselves to make an effective collaboration with the World Bank on these issues. Sometimes we cannot delegate everything to the World Bank and hands-off approach. So it's not working well. So at least whatever conditionality on structural reforms must be monitorable and verifiable ex post. For that purpose, even fund staff need more expertise on the structural issues outside of the core mandate. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Jim. Let me ask you a question. I think one of the themes of the report is that much of this work has to be done before the country enters into program mode. That if you want a country to be able to adjust when there's a shock, the basic strategy for growth has to be in place. The infrastructure for financial management and other kind of management has to be in place. And it's in some sense too late to develop it when in the midst of a program because it takes too long. Do you see fund surveillance able to shift more toward a growth orientation for some of these countries? I mean, typically I think of fund surveillance being focused more around BOP and financial vulnerabilities, but can the fund shift more broadly to thinking about growth even outside of program context?
Charles.
Can I take that one on?
Charles, I was directing it, but Charles, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think definitely growth resilience issues should be at the front and center of surveillance work, and Ken would know better than I, but I believe that this is one of the central themes coming out of the recent comprehensive surveillance review that is now being put in place. And I think also the new resilience and stabilization trust that Ken also mentioned is going to be important here to put in place policies and frameworks that allow countries to respond to shocks, particularly natural disaster shocks. We're now doing an evaluation of the fund's engagement with small island economies, small developing states, where these issues are particularly important, and where the fund certainly has stepped up its attention over the past 10 years to these sorts of issues. But I think it's likely that we're going to find that further steps are needed in this direction. So hopefully the RST will be a new tool that will help the fund move in that direction as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Charles. Ken, I'll give you the floor in just a second, but I want to remind the audience that they can ask questions on the YouTube channel by pressing the question button or emailing events@cgdev.org or Twitter @cgdev or #CGDtalks. Ken, you want to comment on any of the issues that have been raised, but I'd particularly like to hear about sort of the pre-program preparation, if you will.
No, absolutely. I think these are some very valid and good points raised. I would say that the fund has done quite a bit of work in thinking about growth-friendly reforms and structural transformation. I take the point on the fiscal multipliers that Aldo and Rachel raised, but I think the work that's been done since the global financial crisis, looking at how you estimate fiscal multipliers depending on the size of the output gaps, the macro financial conditions, even the political economy constraints, I think it's been very valuable in thinking about how to respond to this particular pandemic. I think it accounts for much of the reversal in thinking about the role of fiscal and monetary policy. So, I would say that the fund has already done quite a bit and helped to inform the debate to the point that we are now discussing it openly, and it's pretty much a regular occurrence in deliberation in fund programs and thinking about debating on the size of the multipliers, taking into account these various characteristics. And on the point about the growth strategy, I agree fully. I think our surveillance does very much discuss with the authorities what is the appropriate growth strategy and structural transformation strategy for an economy. And I was somewhat encouraged in the IEO report that that fund programs do lay the foundations for sustained growth surges in their data. And I have a sense that to some extent, in the initial phases, we need to stabilize the economy to set the proper conditions. And if reforms continue, we will see the benefits, but the benefits may not accrue until sometime over the medium term. And there, I think the fund has done quite a bit of work in thinking about structural reforms. How do you sequence labor versus product market reforms? How do you tie them to the timing of the business cycle? How do you generate political economy gains by emphasizing demand-friendly reforms first before going to the more difficult supply-side reforms? So I do think that there is, the fund has done quite a bit of work, and it really has informed our approach. But the point I would finally end with is I agree fully that it's a holistic approach that's needed. It's surveillance before a shock or a program takes place. It's capacity building to develop the institutions. And it's the proper adequate funding, not just from the fund, but from others, in order to promote and fuel these reforms so they can take hold.
Thanks, Ken. We've got a question from the audience asking if the IEO could elaborate a bit on why the reliance on exchange rate adjustment is limited. Should there actually be more flexibility in exchange rates to share the burden between domestic and external adjustment, or in places like the CFA zone, is that impossible? I mean, is it structures that are holding you back, or is it willingness to go down that path, or a combination of both?
Thanks, Mark. I think exchange rate regime transition is rare relatively anyway, not just in the program context, but in the normal times. But we found still that one might expect a more frequent regime transition in the program context, but it was not. So I think the regime transition is or regime choice is I want to make sure that it is a country's choice, and fund should respect the country's regime choice. The question is, there's a lot of underlying conditions that can make this regime transition more frequent toward greater flexibility. For example, as you would know well, and there's a lot of concerns, so-called fear of floating, and there is a concerns on inflation pass-through. There is a concerns on the balance sheet effect in some cases. So I think it's quite complex process to determine whether to move to the alternative regime in the context program. But our argument or our finding is that, yes, there is a greater scope for use of exchange rate as a tool for adjustment and supporting growth, and particularly if there is some underlying policy framework is in place. So in this context, I think as we discussed what Ken mentioned, and you just raised the issue about the surveillance. I think the importance of surveillance work in preparing or setting some underlying policy framework where the country can adjust very quickly if needed when there is a big shock. So for example, like developing a deep FX market or stabilizing inflation expectation, kind of things, all these things can be done in the context of surveillance and capacity development work, which can be very effective and prove powerful in supporting the adjustment and growth in the program context. Let me stop here.
Others want to comment? Or? I have another question. The fund has thought a bit about distributional consequences of distribution of income on growth. There's been an area of research on that ever since the problems in Tunisia. But there's more to distribution than income distribution. How is the fund starting to look at distribution, say, by gender or by ethnicity or by other, as Rachel said, other groups that will react differently to a set of macroeconomic policies? I mean, it's pretty clear that development science, at least, places great emphasis on gender favorable policies. And that investing, particularly young women and women's entrepreneurship, can really push growth along. Is the fund going to go down that path, and how might it do that?
So was that directed to me, Mark? Okay.
Go ahead, Chuck. Go ahead.
Okay, maybe I go first. I would agree. I think the fund has done quite a bit of work in looking at inequality, gender issues, and such. As Rachel mentioned about growth strategy, the fund has done quite a bit of research showing that closing the gender gap, increasing female labor participation is an important way to generate untapped growth in an economy, particularly in aging societies, which are facing a labor constraint. We've also done a lot of work showing how closing the pay gaps for executives at boards improves the market efficiency and has broader social gains for developing economies in terms of allowing women to boost their income and support overall family stability. So I think this work is going to continue. We're developing a gender strategy now and thinking about how to operationalize this. We've done quite a bit of work looking at gender-based budgeting, for example, in our fiscal affairs department. But I would agree that there is more that can be done in this area in collaboration with our development partners. And inequality in general, I think, is going to be a very critical issue. We've done quite a bit of work showing it's linked to social stability and unrest, to economic growth and performance. But I think you're right. How to operationalize this at a time when we're facing tight budget constraints will be an important challenge looking ahead. And there, I think that the resilience and sustainability trust and other similar trust instruments will be very valuable in providing the space for countries to undertake these types of reforms.
Does the IEO want to come in at all on
that? I think Ken gave an excellent answer to that. And it's not an issue we focused on in this evaluation because, frankly, there's been very limited experience up to now with inclusion of gender-based issues in conditionality. There were one or two examples more recently, but in fact, falling outside our evaluation period. But we still wanted to, in our report, bring attention to the fact that these are important issues and they deserve greater attention. And paying greater attention is thinking about the policies, but it's also developing ways of monitoring what's going on, so that the country and the fund can more quickly identify where there are stress points arising, for example, particular pressures on women or families with children that need to be taken on in the program.
Thanks. Another question that's perhaps directed more toward Dauda. When the fund gets into a program relationship with a country, there can be almost an adversarial relationship, that the country wants support and the fund is trying to limit its support or be parsimonious about it. How do you get around that adversarial relationship to get the kind of outcomes and cooperation that you need? What does the fund need to do differently, but what do countries need to do differently as well?
Well, thank you, Mark. I think what is critical, and I think this has also come out from the report, is to make sure that whatever adjustment strategy you have or growth strategy you have in the program are fully owned by the authorities. The adversarial relation between the fund staff and the authorities, I don't think is necessarily there if the authorities are really sort of convinced that the staff is taking into account their own perspective, but also aligning whatever advice they're making to their strategy. So my guess is the best way to make sure that you overcome that potential adversarial relation with the authority is to make sure that, of course, that you ensure full ownership of the adjustment strategy and of course of the program itself. And at the same time, also there is also room for improving trust between staff and the authorities. I think there are many ways to do so. I myself has written on the past on this issue about how that could happen. The IEO itself also has in the past, actually, in the context of its evaluation of the fund as a confidential advisor, also given a number of suggestions about how you can overcome this type of potential issues. But my sense is, and that's where I would stop, is it is important to make sure that whatever policy that is ultimately set for, or conditionality that is set forth in the context of IMF program, are fully owned by these authorities. Once you do that, I don't think there is necessarily that adversarial concern that is noted. Thank you.
Let me make up, if you will, a parallel question for you, Rachel. Going forward into this new transition, if we're going to transition to a greener and more equitable global economy, it's going to require a lot of financing, and it's going to require the support of multilateral institutions, of donors like the UK and others. How can the fund better cooperate with those? And this is going to be a complex enterprise ahead of us. What's going to be the key to getting that interaction correct, and what roles will the various people play, do you see?
No, thanks. That's a good question. I mean, I would say that I think there's an absolute key role for the fund in the really understanding and scrutinizing how the private sector green finance is flowing. It's hugely important. I mean, we are really excited about the new commitments to green finance from the capital markets, but equally, we are concerned about complex PPP structures and the risk of, complex structures migrating onto sovereign balance sheets. So I think, for me, it's really important that the IMF, all that great work that the fund do on debt transparency, for example, that they're really in the weeds of what's going on in the green financing. So I think that's a sort of scrutiny, surveillance, transparency role that it seems it's really important to play. And I think it's very important that the value for money and the return from those green investments is well understood. It remains important, and what we mustn't do is take our sort of eye off that. I think green financing is important. It's really important, but we must set tough standards of return from that financing. So I just think there's something there when that's really important for the fund to be in the room, if you like, linked to the fiscal transparency piece. I mean, I think more broadly, I think the fund understanding the adaptation burden and the fiscal and foreign exchange burden that comes with the heavy costs of adaptation is going to be really important. And that's about lifting heads above the short term and being sort of inside the room as well as the long-term conversations are had about exactly what's going to be happening to the agricultural sector. What will that feel like? Understanding how that's going to start to play back into forex and fiscal positions. Similarly, for extractive heavy industries, what will that feel like as FDI flows sort of no longer happen into the extractives? But I mean, we're having those conversations with the fund. I mean, I know these are very live issues, and I guess just it comes back to what I said before, Mark. This thing about shocks. I mean, I just think particularly the poorer countries will be more and more subject to shocks, climate shocks, disaster shocks. And if I've got sort of one final thing, it's this thing about, we really want the fund with us in the room when we're looking at shock responsiveness, whether it be fiscal, whether it be balance of payments, whether it be shock responsive social protection. I mean, my personal ambition, I would love to see the fund sitting down with every finance minister and saying, have you got a shock responsive social protection system in place? Because we know if you act early, you can protect your growth gains if there's a shock by acting fast. So, I would love to see that happen. But I mean, obviously I know that the fund are thinking like this and are very much beginning to move into that space. But I think the more the fund are sort of inside the tent, I think as those discussions happen, the better.
Thank you, Rachel. We've wandered a bit out of the program growth link, but I think it's an important wander in some sense, that it is a more holistic endeavor by the fund, that the program distinction in some sense in the years ahead is going to be an artificial one, because all the countries are going to be going through some kind of adjustment. Whether they use the fund explicitly for a financial program or not is going to be is going to be less relevant, I would say, than in the past. We're just about out of time. There was one question from the audience that I think would be a good wrap up, which is from hearing from the IEO and then from the fund. Again, what the next step are, what's the follow-up that's going to take place to make sure the fund is implementing some or all of these recommendations. I mean, I think we've said sort of at the outset that we felt some of these recommendations we've heard before. So what is it that's going to follow on? How does that process work? And how can, if you will, others outside the fund infrastructure be involved in that? Charles first and then Ken, or Charles and June, either one. Both.
Sure. I mean, there is a formal follow-up process. Within the next 6 months, management with staff have to prepare an implementation plan to present to the executive board. In fact, Ken will be, I think, playing a key role in putting together that implementation plan. The executive board then needs to approve that implementation plan. So if they're not fully satisfied with the steps being proposed, they can go back to management and staff and ask for a strengthening of that plan. And then that the actions in the plan are monitored. Every year we have a monitoring report prepared by the Office of Internal Audit, which assesses whether the steps in the plan have actually been followed in a timely manner. So it's a pretty robust follow-up process. I think the key, as always, is finding measures that are serious and not just shallow, easy to do, but not necessarily having a fundamental impact. And that's going to be the challenge. And in the same ways as the fund working with the country, it's going to be really important that management and staff take full ownership of the plan. Part of our task is to work closely in a constructive way with the institution to bring to light some of these issues, but then it's really going to be up to management and staff to follow through in a meaningful way. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Let me just ask Charles, is that management implementation plan and the follow-up and the audit all available publicly? Can you go to the IMF or the IEO website to find it?
Yeah.
You search hard enough?
Absolutely. This is all public information, and as Ken mentioned, or a new implementation plan on strengthening bank fund collaboration is about to be put on the website, and the plan in response to this evaluation should be available on the website in about 6 months, and then the periodic monitoring report is also a public document. So it's all very transparent.
So it's there. Ken, you want to comment a bit on follow-up?
Yeah, no, I think Charles summarized it well. We do have a formal process. We're working closely with the IEO and identifying these concrete, specific, measurable measures to put in place. But let me just step back and I just make the broader point that I think Rachel and Dodd are also highlighted, that this is a more of a holistic approach is needed here, that we have to strengthen everything from our ongoing surveillance before a shock or a program takes place. We have to look again at how to better integrate our capacity development into our surveillance, but also supporting our program objectives. And we need to constantly learn about the adjustment programs, taking on board the social and distributional consequences of the strategy here. And we have a lot of different ongoing reviews underway. Charles mentioned a few on bank fund collaboration. We also have a CD review that's underway. And we have another one that's looking at the operational guidance for conditionality, which we expect to finalize sometime in 2022. So we're very much a learning institution, and we welcome the feedback from you and others and how we can better improve our processes to better serve our member countries.
Great, thank you, Ken. Well, I think that just about winds us up. I think we're out of time. Let me thank all the participants for coming today, for actively participating, the audience too, for their questions. And I think, as I said at the outset, this is a critical time for the world and for the fund. I think we all agree that this report is extremely well done, very soundly researched and well-founded, and gives a great starting point for the fund to move forward. And I said at the beginning something about revolution. Ken said, well, the fund doesn't go through revolutions, it goes through evolutions, but I think it needs a fast evolution given the times we're facing. So I hope that this report and the other ones you mentioned, Ken, are really going to turn the ship of the fund. And I see lots of potential for that. It's going to take a lot of leadership and a lot of support, if you will, not just from fund staff, but from your allies and people who think the fund's an important institution around the world. I think you have some of them there. So thank you again for the report, for your good comments, and for your participation today. And again, thanks to the audience for listening. Take care.